let's review parenting a little bit and also introduce lens flares and working with the graph editor. So I'm going to add, once again, my basic logo object. And in this case, I'm just going to have it sitting right there. But what I want to have is a light that goes spinning around it. Now I'm going to just add a light. Let's make it a point light, call it flare light. Move it over here. And what I want to have happen is I want this light to circle around this logo as it moves forward. You know, a very exciting thing. However, if I was to go in, oh, it jumped back. I didn't keyframe it. Create key. And even with auto key turned on, go in and try to animate that spinning around this object. That would be a long time, and it would take an awful lot of work for it to get exactly the way I want it. A much easier way would be to parent it to a null. Let's just reset that so it's back in the center. Create key. Parent it to a null and have the null spin. So let's do that. I'm going to move this up here. Auto key. Add null. I'm going to call it flare null. I'm going to go into my original scene editor and just grab the flare light, scooch it over so it's parented to that null. Now, when I grab my null and move it, that light comes along with it. And I want that null, I want that light to spin around. So I'm going to rotate it, but I only want it to rotate on the P. Maybe go all the way around in 30 frames. And I can do it manually, or I can just punch it in, because I know I want 360 degrees. So there we are. I also want it to move forward. So how would I do that? Well, I could keyframe it just moving, but then it kind of messes up the keyframe of the rotating. Or I could do it on separate channels, or I could do it old school way by just adding another null. I'm going to call this flare null move, and I'm going to keyframe this null, flare null move, and start over here at frame 0. And this needs to go a little longer. We'll go 150 and end there at 150. Oh, I just destroyed it because I had auto key on. But I moved that. So we'll just move it back. There we go. So I need to parent the flare null to the move null. So the flare is parented to the flare null, and the flare null, and this is the one that rotates. I want to rename that, so I'm going to right click on it, and it brings up this set of requesters. Rename flare null rotate. This is just so I can tell at a glance what each of the things are doing. So now it's moving and it's rotating. It looks like I could move my move null a little bit more forward. However, I'm running out of turns before I get to the end of the rope here. So I could just go to the end and at 150 create a keyframe for my rotate null. But it's actually more effective if I go into my graph editor and do it there, because I can do these things. I have each of these channels. The only channel I care about right now is this one. This is my rotation on P. Now here are your tools for dealing with everything in the graph editor. The first one allows you to grab it and move it, change the value. And if you hold down the control button, you can change it in time. Or if it's selected, if you can see it, it's yellow, you can just punch in the values that I want. Now what's happening is it is just going up that far and then not moving anymore. We have our pre and post behavior. And these are very important things to use because you can go repeat, oscillate, which means go back and forth, offset repeat, which just means continue on forever the way it was going, or linear, and in this case it looks like the same thing. The difference is this is my add keyframe tool, so I can add another one here. That is what linear does. It just keeps it going in a straight line from the last 2 points as opposed to offset repeat, which just keeps going if I was making kind of a thumping motion. Go back to change. Those are really the two most important buttons that you'll find here, which is the manipulate and the add key. So I'm just going to delete that because I just want it to rotate. And if I want it to go faster, I can just go in, tell it to do a full rotation at 15. Or if I want to do math, same thing would happen if I just doubled it down here. It's 720. Or say, alright, I wanted to do 6 rotations instead. 6 times 360, a little more math than I want. I put my little multiply button here, hit 6. Oh, it has got the degree in there. Alright. 360 times 6, it figures it out for me. I think I want it at 360, and it's just continuing on forever. In case you didn't catch that, you have the ability to do math right in these boxes. That's 360. I hit the plus button. 180. It does the math for me. Saves you from reaching over for the calculator. What do we have here? We have it continually rotating around as it's moving forward. Well, that's pretty cool. Let's take a look. And there it goes. And if we render that, well, it's got the lousy surfacing on it, but the light's going around, but it's not really sparkling like we want. Well, let's introduce lens flares. Under Object Properties, we have this lens flare option. I'll turn it on. Nothing happens. Lens flares kind of need to be rendered. And that is the classic Lightwave lens flare that you have seen forever. Since the days of the Amiga, where it made it famous. The problem is everybody started using the exact same lens flare and it got old. Not real fast, but it got old. It just got old. So what we want to do is go into our lens flare options right here and mess with it. One thing, we can make it bigger. And let's see. Turn on a star filter. Maybe turn off the central ring and the central red. And re-render that. And let's see what it looks like. Wow. Have you seen a lens flare like that? Maybe, maybe not. Now the other thing you can do with lens flares is you can get a representation in your Opengl. I'm opening up my display options. Under display, display options, and there's a setting in here to show way at the bottom Opengl lens flares. This kind of works. It gives you some idea. It's not exactly right, but it's close enough most of the time. Now what we have going on here, we don't know if that lens flare is going in front or behind the object. Yeah, I think I want that to be a little bit tighter in on the object. And maybe not move off quite so far at the end. So this is why doing it separately can be a great advantage. Alright, so yeah, it's still too far. Let's move this up. Okay. At some points, it's actually moving behind the object. And let's prove that by going to our perspective mode. It's behind the object, but in our camera view, we're still seeing it. In fact, if we render it, it doesn't look like it's going behind the object. That's where we have these other options. For our light properties, under lens flare options, fade behind object. I turn that on. Our Opengl doesn't change. However, it's gone. Turns out what we really want is glow behind objects. And ignore that message. And it actually appears as if it is behind the object, which is really what we really want. Now there's a lot of options in here. Lens reflections, that's a big one. That's fun to watch in Opengl. And there it goes. And let me tell you, even though in the CGI world we may be sick to death of lens flares, clients can't get enough of it. You throw in a lens flare and they are just extremely happy. And let's just throw in a little trick here. It's in front. Turn on cameras. Turn on anti-aliasing. We'll go medium and motion blur. But we're going to give it an insane amount of motion blur, and we'll render that out. And when it's finally done rendering, we should see a long chain. Instead of having one tight little lens flare, we actually have this streak of lens flare going around. Now this doesn't look all impressive on itself, but once this is rendered out, let's just go 1,000. Once this is completely rendered out, it gives this very snaky, smoky kind of look to it. Not like something you're used to seeing anywhere else. And I might even bump that up a little bit higher. So that will be fully rendered and on the CD. So that is how you use lens flares. I will also point out, on this CD, there's a directory called FlarePot, which has examples of all different kinds of lens flares to use. Let's save this one. Save scene as logo flare. Now, say I wanted to add, let's see, say I wanted to replace this flare with one I've previously built. The option is load from scene. Under File, you select Load Items from Scene. This is different from loading a scene. When you load a scene, it clears the previous scene and loads the new scene up fresh. When you load from scene, as in load items from scene, it only loads those items in the scene, and it leaves all the items that were previously there still there. So let's select one of these. UFO looks good. Load lights from scene as well as objects. That's an important question because say you built a car in a garage and you want to load it into a city scene, you probably have your lights already loaded up so you don't want them. But in this case, yes, we want to load this scene because the only thing in there is this big stinking light, which I called UFO. And I'm going to delete that keyframe. Go to my flare. Well, let's just leave it in there. We'll double them up. I'm going to also parent the UFO to that same null. So both the flare and the UFO are parented. But I'm going to move it down. Oh, that looks interesting. Let's knock this down to, say, only 250%. Render that out. So we got crazy going on here. Now you should be at the point where you can create your text object, extrude it, bevel it, and now all I've done was add some lens flares. And when this gets rendered out, it's going to look super cool. Let's save this one. we'll just save it over the old scene. So that's going to be our flare scene that's going to be on the CD. Put this back to 50. And that's not even playing with any of the other lighting or putting in a cool background. Most clients, most bosses, when they see something like this, they're going to get pretty excited. And they're going to think you are so cool. Because it is cool. Now this is moving through the object, so we want to go back in and set our lens flare options so that if it fades behind the object, it completely turns off once it's behind. Sometimes that's great. Most time you want glow behind object. So we'll have that. And just ignore that message. So that is the introduction to the graph editor. And the graph editor is everywhere. The graph editor is even in the light properties. By the way, to change the color of the lens flare, you need to change the light. Now notice the UFO, the light intensity is 0, but it's still showing up. That's because all that matters is this light intensity here. And I can even have that pulsate by going into my graph editor and just adding frames. And if I just wanted to repeat or oscillate, I just select that action. And I bet you I can even see that while I'm scrubbing. I think I need to have it a little bit more pronounced. Lens flare options. Oh yeah, because it's going between 100 and 140. So we'll just grab this one, or just tell it it's only going to be 25 there. Pull that one down. Pull that one up. Oh, that's interesting. So now it'll be pulsating when it very bright there, less so. In and out. Cool stuff. And we'll save that scene. And load it up. Take a look at it. Play with your graph editor. Play with your lens flares. Just don't stick with the default lens flare because we're all tired of that. And there's so much more you can do. You can load up the scenes from the flare plot. These are just things that I spent an afternoon playing with lens flares, and these are things I came up with. There's plenty more yet to discover using lens flares.